park ranger, scanning a restricted zone of the Ozarks, discovered a mysterious moss-covered house that was perfectly camouflaged into the deep woods. He expected to find a criminal hideout, but when his team cracked the rusted seal of a hidden trap door inside, the breathtaking sight that greeted them in the darkness made the entire squad freeze. Drop a comment with where you're watching from today, and don't forget to subscribe to see what's coming up next. The limestone bedrock of the Ozark Plateau holds secrets like a miser holds gold, tightly buried deep and often only yielded to those willing to bleed for the discovery. Dave Norman knew this better than anyone, for the mountains had taken as much from him as they had ever given. At 48, Dave was a man eroded by time and trauma, much like the craggy bluffs he patrolled as a senior park ranger. He stood 6 feet tall, though a slight stoop in his shoulders often hid his full height, a habit formed from years of moving through dense underbrush and perhaps from carrying invisible weights that no rucksack could account for. On this particular Tuesday in late November, the forest was a study in desolation. The tourists had long since retreated to their warm suburban homes, leaving the park to the true locals, the white-tailed deer, the bobcats, and the silence. It was the silence of the deep sector, a restricted zone of the national forest known for its treacherous sinkholes and labyrinthine ravines that Dave sought. He told his superiors he was mapping potential erosion zones, but in truth, he was hunting for solitude. He adjusted the strap of his binoculars, his knuckles white against the black rubber. The wind bit through his dark green, weather-resistant park ranger jacket, the specialized fabric rustling softly against the stillness. He wore standard-issue tan tactical cargo pants, the kind reinforced at the knees and rife with pockets for maps, compasses, and evidence bags, and sturdy, brown hiking boots that had seen more mud than pavement. A green baseball cap, pulled low, shielded his eyes from the flat, gray light of an overcast sky that promised freezing rain before nightfall. He was 3 miles off the nearest designated trail, a distance that in the Ozarks might as well have been the moon. Here, the terrain didn't roll. It buckled. "Dispatch. This is Unit 4 Alpha," Dave murmured into his shoulder mic, his voice gravelly, unused to speaking after 6 hours of hiking. "Status check. I'm near the Chimney Rock Ridge line. Signal is spotty." The radio crackled, a burst of static that sounded like frying bacon. "Copy. 4 Alpha. You're breaking up. Check-in logged. Be advised, weather front is moving faster than anticipated. Temp dropping. Copy. Out." Dave unslung his pack and retrieved his drone case. It was a high-end Enterprise model, equipped with thermal imaging and LiDAR, tools usually reserved for search and rescue. Today, he was using it to look for illegal logging or poaching blinds, but mostly he was using it to see what the naked eye missed. The drone whirred to life, a synthetic hornet rising into the leaden sky. Dave watched the screen on the controller, his calloused thumbs manipulating the joysticks with practiced ease. The screen showed the canopy from above, a tapestry of rust-colored oak leaves, brown hickory, and the dark, evergreen spikes of cedar trees. He pushed the drone higher, cresting the ridge he couldn't physically climb. The feed stabilized. He toggled the view, stripping away the color to look at the terrain relief. That's when the glitch happened. It wasn't a signal loss. It was a contradiction in the landscape. Nature, in its chaotic wisdom, abhors a straight line. Rivers meander, trees twist seeking light, and rocks fracture along jagged fault lines. But on the drone's monitor, in the shadow of a limestone overhang deep within a narrow ravine, Dave saw geometry, a perfect 90-degree angle, Then another. He frowned, squinting at the small screen. He dropped the drone's altitude, hovering it dangerously close to the grasping branches of the canopy. The camera focused. Beneath a heavy blanket of overgrown briars and fallen timber, the earth had been manipulated. It wasn't a natural formation. It was a berm, a definitive, engineered ridge of earth creating a perimeter. "What in the hell?" Dave whispered. He toggled to thermal. The screen shifted to a spectrum of blues and purples. The ground was cold, soaking up the November chill, but right in the center of those geometric lines, the thermal signature went pitch black, a cold void. It meant deep earth. It meant a cave or a basement, or something that went down far enough to escape the surface temperature entirely. Dave brought the drone back, catching it out of the air with a practiced hand. He packed it away, his heart rate climbing a few beats per minute. This wasn't an animal den. This was man-made. In the Ozarks, finding a man-made structure in the deep woods usually meant one of two things: an old, abandoned homestead rotting into mulch, or a current, active meth lab or grow operation. The first was archaeology, the second was a potential firefight. Dave checked his sidearm, a Sig Sauer P320, and sure a round was chambered. The transition from naturalist to law enforcement officer was instantaneous. His posture shifted. He stopped looking at the trees as biology and started seeing them as cover. He began the descent into the ravine. The trek down was brutal. The limestone here was slick with moss and damp leaves, treacherous as ice. Every step had to be calculated. A twisted ankle here meant hypothermia and a long, painful wait for a rescue that might not hear his radio. Dave moved with the fluidity of a predator, placing his feet carefully to avoid snapping twigs. As he neared the coordinates he'd marked, the forest changed character. The undergrowth became thicker, aggressively thorny. Multiflora rose and greenbrier wove a natural barbed wire fence that seemed almost intentional. Dave paused, kneeling to inspect a game trail. The leaves were disturbed. He traced the line with his eyes and stopped. 3 feet in front of him, hidden beneath a scattering of oak leaves, was a snare. But it wasn't a simple wire loop for a rabbit. It was a braided steel cable, anchored to the base of a hickory tree, tensioned with a heavy counterweight log suspended in the branches above. This was a man trap. If he had walked through it, the loop would have cinched his leg, and the counterweight would have hoisted him upside down or shattered his tibia. He pulled a knife from his belt and carefully disabled the trigger mechanism, his breath pluming in the cold air. Fresh grease, he noted, rubbing the cable between his gloved fingers. This wasn't a relic. Someone was active here. The geometry he'd seen from the air wasn't just a foundation. It was a fortress. Dave moved slower now, weapon unholstered, held at the low ready. He scanned the canopy, the ridge lines, the shadows. The silence of the woods felt heavier, watching him. He thought of his wife, Sarah, gone 5 years now to cancer. She had hated the woods, finding them oppressive. They hide things, she used to say. They keep secrets. Today, she was right. He rounded a massive outcrop of gray limestone, ancient geology that looked like the stacked bones of the earth. And there it was. It was almost invisible, a masterclass in camouflage. The structure was built directly into the side of the steep, rocky hill, utilizing the natural overhang of the limestone bluff as a partial roof. The facade was constructed of rough-hewn, dry-stacked limestone rocks that matched the surrounding geology so perfectly that from 20 yards away it looked like a natural rock fall. Dave stopped, positioning himself behind, the thick trunk of a white oak observing. A heavy, dark wooden door made of vertical planks sat in the center of the stone wall, recessed slightly into the earth to cast a shadow that hid its shape. The roof of the structure was a living extension of the forest floor, a rounded mound heavily carpeted in thick green moss and tall fescue grass. It flowed seamlessly into the hill behind it. The image before him was striking. The gray of the stone, the vibrant, almost electric green of the moss in the diffuse light, and the imposing silence of the door. To the right, a retaining wall of stacked stones held back the slope, indicating that this wasn't just a shack, it was an engineered site. Dave stood motionless for 10 minutes. He watched for smoke. He listened for the hum of a generator, the murmur of voices, the smell of cooking chemicals. Nothing. Just the wind rattling the dry leaves and the first few drops of freezing rain tapping against the brim of his cap. Keyed his radio, keeping his voice to a whisper. Dispatch, 4 Alpha. I have located a structure in Sector 9. Possible illegal encampment. Highly concealed. Evidence of booby traps on the approach. Requesting backup. Tactical response required. The radio static was worse down in the ravine, but the dispatch officer's voice cut through enough to be understood. Copy, 4 Alpha. Unit 2 and Unit 5 are closest, but they are 40 minutes out. State troopers are on standby. Do you have eyes on subjects? Negative. No movement. No heat signature on the initial drone sweep, but the structure is earth-sheltered. It's masking everything. Hold position, 4 Alpha. Do not engage unless fired upon. Wait for the team. Dave lowered the radio. Hold position, he muttered to himself. The soldier in him knew that was the right call, but the ranger in him, the man who knew this land was being scarred by whoever built this, felt a pull to move closer. He waited. The rain began to fall harder, turning the forest floor into a slick, dark mud. The temperature plummeted. Dave zipped his jacket higher, tucking his chin in. He watched the door. It looked ancient. The wood was dark, almost black, likely treated with creosote or charred to prevent rot. 45 minutes later, the sound of snapping branches to the east announced the arrival of the backup. It was Sergeant Miller's unit. Miller was a younger man, sharp-jawed, ambitious, and trained in SWAT tactics. He moved with a team of 3 other Rangers, all carrying AR-15s and wearing heavy tactical vests. Dave signaled them with a low whistle. Miller approached, his eyes widening as he followed Dave's finger pointing toward the mossy hill. "Holy Mother," Miller whispered, crouching beside Dave. "I walked right past that on the ridge. Didn't see a thing." "That's the point," Dave said. "I found a counterweight snare on the game trail. Professional grade." "Grow up?" Miller asked, scanning the windows, or rather, the lack of them. "Maybe, but there's no smell, no ventilation pipes. Usually, a meth lab stinks like cat piss and ammonia. This smells like wet rock." Miller nodded to his team. "All right, stack up. Standard breach. Norman, you've got point since you know the terrain." They moved in a phalanx, silent and deadly. They reached the retaining wall. Dave moved to the door, checking the frame for tripwires. Nothing. He ran his hand over the wood. It was oak, incredibly hard, petrified by age and elements. There was no handle, just a heavy iron ring. Miller aimed his thermal camera at the door. "I'm getting nothing. It's the same temp as the air. If there's anyone in there, they're dead or they're deep." Dave nodded. He gripped the iron ring. "Breaching," he whispered. He pulled. The door groaned, a sound of wood fibers tearing and rusted hinges screaming in protest. It was heavy, far heavier than a modern door. With a heave of his shoulder, Dave swung it inward. The darkness inside was absolute. "Flashlights," Miller barked. 5 beams of high-intensity LED light cut into the gloom. They expected to see a lab, or a squatter's den filled with trash. Instead, they saw an empty room. It was a turf house, traditional in design but executed with military precision. The walls were lined with large, flat stones. The floor was packed earth, hard as concrete. But it was empty. Just a few rotting wooden shelves along the back wall and a decaying, mold-eaten rug in the center of the room. Clear left. Clear right. The team swept the small space in seconds. "It's empty," Miller said, lowering his rifle slightly. "Just an old root cellar?" Dave holstered his pistol and walked to the center of the room. He breathed in. The air was stagnant, untouched. He looked at the ceiling. The timber beams were hand-hewn, showing the marks of an adze. This wasn't modern construction. This was old. Very old. He stepped onto the rotten rug. Clang. The sound wasn't a thud. It was the resonance of metal on metal, muffled by the fabric. The entire squad froze. "Did you hear that?" Miller asked. Dave knelt, ignoring the pain in his knees. He grabbed the corner of the rug, which disintegrated in his grip, revealing what lay beneath. It was a trap door, iron, solid, heavy, and covered in a layer of rust that looked like dried blood. It was recessed into a stone frame. "Thermal was right," Dave said, his voice echoing slightly in the small stone room. "There's a void beneath us." "Bomb shelter?" Miller suggested. "Look at the ironwork." Dave traced a finger over the hinges. "Hand-forged. No rivets. This isn't Cold War stuff, Miller. This is older." He found the latch. It was fused shut by oxidation. Dave stood up and motioned to one of the rangers who carried a heavy breaching tool, a Halligan bar. "Crack it," Dave ordered. The ranger wedged the fork of the bar into the seam of the trap door. He leaned his weight into it. Metal screeched against metal, a sound like a dying animal. The rust seal held for a moment, then shattered with a sharp pop. The ranger grunted, levering the heavy iron plate upward. As the door opened, a gust of air rushed out of the hole, not in. It hissed, escaping the pressure of the earth. Dave was hit with a smell that stopped him cold. It wasn't the smell of rot or death. It was the smell of a museum. Dry dust, gun oil, treated leather, and old paper. "Flashlights down the hole," Dave commanded. They crowded around the aperture. The beams pierced the darkness below, cutting through the swirling dust motes that had been disturbed for the first time in decades, centuries. The light hit the floor of the chamber below, about 12 feet down. "My God," Miller breathed. Dave stared, his brain struggling to process the image. Below them was not a jagged cave, but a finished room. Wooden floorboards, walls lined with vertical timber, and everywhere, reflecting the LED lights, was the glint of metal. "Ladder," Dave said, finding the iron rungs set into the wall. "I'm going down. Dave, wait for hazmat. The air quality. The air is rushing out, Miller. It's positive pressure. It's safe. I'm going." Dave didn't wait for an argument. He swung his legs into the hole. He climbed down the rusted rungs, testing each one before committing his weight. When his boots hit the wooden floorboards below, a cloud of fine dust puffed up. He unclipped his radio light and swept the room. It was a time capsule, a perfect, hermetically sealed slice of history. To his left, racks of rifles stood in disciplined rows. They weren't AR-15s or hunting shotguns. They were long, elegant muskets with dark walnut stocks and brass fittings. Dave, a history buff by necessity of his job, recognized them immediately. Pattern 1853, Enfields, the primary weapon of the infantry during the Civil War. There were dozens of them. To his right, wooden crates were stacked waist-high. Stenciled on the side of one in faded black paint were the letters CSA and the words black powder, danger. "What are you seeing, Dave?" Miller called from above. "You're not going to believe this," Dave whispered. He walked further into the room. In the center sat a large oak table. On it lay a map, pinned at the corners. Dave shone his light on it. It was a hand-drawn topographical map of the Ozark region, but the towns were wrong. No highways, no reservoirs. Instead, red ink marked supply trails, ambush points, and Union garrisons. The date in the corner read December 1864 on. "It's a command center," Dave said, his voice trembling with the magnitude of the find. "Bushwhackers, Civil War guerrillas. This is a bunker." Miller and two others scrambled down the ladder, their modern tactical boots clumping loudly on the 19th century floorboards. Are those real?" Miller asked, reaching toward a rifle. "Don't touch it," Dave snapped. "Look at the grease." He pointed to the barrels. They were coated in a thick, yellowish substance that had hardened but not cracked. "Cosmoline, or tallow. They pack them for long-term storage. That's why they aren't piles of rust. The landslide." Dave looked up at the ceiling of the bunker. Heavy timber beams supported the earth above. The landslide that created the ridge outside, Dave pieced it together. It must have sealed the ventilation shafts in the main entrance right after they stocked this place. It created a vacuum. No oxygen, no moisture. It preserved everything. He moved to the back of the room. There was a cot, the wool blanket moth-eaten but intact. Beside it, a small writing desk. On the desk sat a lantern, dry of oil, and a leather-bound book. A journal. Dave pulled a pair of latex evidence gloves from his tactical pants. He gently touched the leather cover. It was supple. "Secure the perimeter upstairs," Dave told Miller, his eyes never leaving the book. "I need to document this before the humidity from our breath ruins it." Miller hesitated, then nodded. "I'll keep 2 guys up top, 2 down here with you." As Miller climbed back up, Dave carefully opened the journal. The paper was brittle, yellowed parchment. The ink was brown, written with a fountain pen in a tight, jagged script. December 12th, 1864. The winter is harder than the Yankees. We are cold in the bone. The men are losing heart. Captain Anderson says we must hold the ridge, but I see the eyes of my soldiers. They are hollow. We are not fighting for the cause anymore. We are fighting for the holes we dig to die in. Dave turned the page, the sound loud in the quiet room. He felt a phantom chill, not from the temperature but from the words. He knew that feeling. The soldier's fatigue, the point where the mission blurs and survival becomes the only objective. December 20th, 1864. I have ordered the cache sealed. If we are to move, we cannot carry the heavy iron. We will leave it for the spring offensive, if there is a spring. I miss Sarah. I wonder if she remembers the face of the man she married, or if she only dreams of the ghost I have become. Dave stopped. Sarah. The name hit him like a physical blow. His own wife, Sarah, had died in a hospital bed, fighting a war against her own cells. He remembered the feeling of helplessness, the same hollow look in his own eyes that this Confederate captain, a man named Silas Vance described. Outside, the storm finally broke in full fury. Thunder shook the ground, vibrating through the limestone walls of the bunker. Dust trickled from the ceiling timbers. "Dave!" Miller's voice crackled over the radio, urgent now. "We have contact. Multiple bogies approaching from the North Ridge." Dave snapped the journal shut. "Define contact." "Armed. Subjects. 3 of them. They aren't hikers. They're moving tactically. I think they saw our lights. The looters. The people who set the snares. They hadn't abandoned the site. They had been watching it, perhaps searching for this very entrance for years, drawn by the same legends of Confederate gold that filled the local dive bars." "Defensive positions," Dave ordered, the ranger vanishing, the combat engineer taking over. "Kill the lights down here. Don't let them know how many of us are inside." Dave scrambled up the ladder, his pistol drawn. He emerged into the turf house, the sound of rain hammering against the stone roof deafening. Miller was by the door, peering through a crack. "They're flanking. They have hunting rifles. They want what's in the basement," Dave said. "They think it's gold." "Is it?" Miller asked. "No," Dave said, checking his sight picture. "It's just history, but they'll kill us for it anyway." A crack echoed outside, a high-velocity round striking the stone facade of the turf house. Chips of limestone sprayed inward. "Federal officers," Miller screamed into the rain. "Drop your weapons." The answer was another shot, this one tearing through the rotting wood of the doorframe inches from Miller's face. "Engage!" Dave yelled. The team returned fire, short, controlled bursts from their AR-15s. The sound was deafening in the confined space. Dave moved to the side of the door, peering into the gloom. He didn't have a rifle, but he had the thermal drone controller still strapped to his chest. "Cover me!" Dave yelled. He pulled the controller out. He couldn't fly the drone. It was packed away, but the controller could still link if the drone was powered on. He grabbed the case, unzipped it, and jammed the battery in. He tossed the drone out the door onto the wet grass. It didn't need to fly. It just needed to look. He synced the screen. The camera on the drone, sitting in the mud, angled upward. He toggled to thermal. 3 bright orange heat signatures glowing against the cold blue forest. One behind a hickory tree at 10 o'clock. One prone behind a rock at 12. One moving to the right flank. "Miller, flanker, 3 o'clock, 20 yards, behind the laurel bush." Miller shifted his aim. "Got him." He fired 3 rounds. The flanker screamed, a heat signature dropping to the ground. "Hit! Suspect down." The other 2 shooters hesitated. They were bullies, scavengers, used to intimidating hikers or shooting unsuspecting deer. They weren't ready for a coordinated tactical team with thermal overwatch. "We have you on thermal," Dave roared, his voice projecting with the authority of a man who had shouted over mortars in the desert. "You are outgunned and surrounded. Drop the weapons or the next rounds go center mass." Silence. Then the sound of a rifle hitting the mud. "Don't shoot! Don't shoot!" A voice cried out, thin and terrified in the storm. "Hands! Let me see hands." The tactical team moved out, securing the 2 remaining suspects. They were rough men, bearded, dressed in mismatched camo, looking less like master criminals and more like desperate addicts chasing a fairy tale score. As Miller cuffed them, Dave stood in the doorway of the turf house, the adrenaline slowly draining from his system, leaving him cold and aching. He looked back at the open trap door, the dark mouth leading to the past. The violence of the present had brushed against the violence of the past, and both were ugly, desperate things. Hours later, after the suspects had been hiked out by the state troopers and the site was secured with crime scene tape and floodlights, Dave returned to the bunker alone. The archaeologists were already on their way from the university, but Dave had one last thing to do. He sat at the desk and opened the journal to the final entry. The date was January 1st, 1865, or the new year brings no hope, only snow. I have dismissed the men. I told them to go home, to hide their uniforms and burn their papers. The war is lost, and I will not spend another day killing for a dead thing. I am sealing the bunker. Let the earth have the rifles. Let the earth have the hate. I am going to walk north. I am going to find Sarah. If I am to be judged, let it be by God, not by generals. Dave stared at the words. Let the earth have the hate. Silas Vance hadn't died here. He hadn't been trapped. He had chosen to leave. He had buried his war so he could live. The landslide that happened days later was just nature sealing the deal, protecting Silas's decision. Dave closed the book. He ran his hand over the cracked leather. For 5 years, Dave had been burying himself in these woods, hiding in the silence, nursing his grief like a wound he didn't want to heal. He was guarding his own internal bunker, stocked with memories and regrets. He stood up. The air in the bunker felt lighter now, or perhaps he just breathed it differently. He climbed the ladder, emerging into the cold, clean air of the storm-washed forest. The rain had stopped. The clouds were breaking, revealing a sliver of moon. Miller was waiting by the tree line. "You okay, Dave? You were down there a while." Dave looked at the Mossy house, then at the vast, dark expanse of the Ozarks around him. "Yeah," Dave said, and for the first time in a long time, he meant it. "I'm okay. We'll hold the scene until the Historical Society gets here tomorrow," Miller said. "You should head back. Get warm." "I will," Dave said. He turned to leave, but stopped. He looked back at the hidden door one last time. He touched the brim of his cap, a silent salute, not to the soldier Silas was, but to the man he became when he walked away. Dave Norman turned on his heel and began the hike out. He didn't look at the ground for snares. He looked up through the breaking canopy at the stars. He thought about calling his daughter in St. Louis. He hadn't seen her in 6 months. It was time to leave the woods. It was time to go home. The Mossy house remained behind him, silent and empty once more, its secrets told, its ghosts finally, truly at rest.